I had always thought my neighborhood was normal. Quiet streets, manicured lawns, neighbors who waved hello, that sort of thing. But that was before Karen moved in. You know the type, the one who carries a clipboard like it's a weapon and treats every sidewalk crack like a personal crime scene. At first, I laughed. I mean, who really cares if your hedges are a little uneven? Apparently, Karen did. It started small. A passive-aggressive note about my mailbox, then an email about my trash bins not being perfectly aligned on collection day. Soon, the emails turned into official-looking notices about imaginary violations. Your welcome mat is not up to code. Your garage light is too bright and disturbs the community. I remember reading one and thinking, okay, this has to be a joke. It was. Karen was deadly serious. She had a way of acting like she owned the neighborhood. She'd drive past in her SUV, blasting the horn at neighbors who dared to park a little crooked or trim their bushes in ways she didn't approve. She loved to make dramatic appearances at community meetings, raising her hand like she was declaring war on poor, unsuspecting homeowners. I tried to ignore her, but ignoring Karen was harder than it sounded. She had this energy, like a hurricane in sensible shoes, and somehow she always found a way to touch every little thing in her path. Then came the notice that changed everything, a mandatory inspection of my house, scheduled for Saturday morning. The notice was filled with threatening language about fines, violations, and corrective action. I stared at the email for a long time, sipping my coffee, trying to convince myself this was nothing more than an overzealous neighbor. But my gut told me this was different. This was personal. Karen wasn't just following rules anymore. She was hunting. I spent the rest of the week on edge. Every creak in the floorboards, every rustle of the wind through the trees made me glance over my shoulder. I caught her car circling the block twice, sometimes 3 times, each time slower, more deliberate. I started noticing small signs that something wasn't right. The neighbor's dog barking in the middle of the night, a faint knock on my door when no one was there, footprints in the flower bed, the kind of subtle chaos that makes you question your own sanity. My friends laughed when I told them. She can't just come into your house, they said. It's illegal. I laughed too, but not entirely. Karen didn't seem like the type to let legality get in the way of her mission. She was the kind of person who believed the rules applied only to other people, and she had absolutely no idea who she was messing with. Little did she know I wasn't just some regular homeowner. I'd spent years handling situations like this, the kind that start small and spiral into absolute chaos if ignored. The night before the inspection, I double-checked every lock, made sure the security cameras were recording, and even pretended to be asleep in a few rooms just to see if she would try anything. Of course, she didn't know I was watching. She had no idea that the person she thought she was intimidating was trained to handle things like this calmly, methodically, and sometimes with a little poetic justice. And then came the sound that made my heart skip a beat, tires crunching over the gravel driveway. My window gave me a perfect view. Karen's SUV parked suspiciously close to the curb, engine running, eyes scanning the street like a hawk. She wasn't leaving until she got what she wanted. I could feel the tension building in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. She thought she was in control, but she had no idea what was coming. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath. This wasn't just another petty neighborhood battle. This was war. Karen had crossed a line she would soon regret, and I was ready to make sure she understood exactly what that meant. The stage was set, and the first move was about to be made. Little did she know I was ready for her. The morning of the inspection, I woke up with that uneasy feeling you get right before something bad is about to happen. The air felt heavier, charged with anticipation, like the calm before a storm. My coffee tasted bitter, my mind racing through all the scenarios that Karen might attempt. She wasn't going to just knock politely on my door and check a clipboard. No, she had already shown she operated on a completely different level. A level that ignored boundaries, common sense, and as I would soon discover, the law. As I looked out the window, I noticed her SUV parked a few houses down. She sat behind the wheel, scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing toward my house. There was a smugness in her posture, the kind of look that said, I own this street and I'm about to prove it. I tightened my grip on my coffee mug. I had handled difficult situations before, but Karen was in her element and she thrived on chaos. I tried to go about my morning as usual, making breakfast, feeding the dog, even checking the mail. But every noise, every shadow felt amplified. The creak of the porch floor, the whistle of the wind through the trees, the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower, it all made me flinch. And then I saw it, a movement at the edge of my yard near the garden, a quick, deliberate shuffle. Karen was packing or maybe pretending to adjust something in her SUV. Either way, she was watching, waiting, plotting. I went back inside and checked the locks again. Deadbolts, chain locks, window latches, everything was secure, just in case. I had a habit of being prepared, and Karen made me double down. I even checked the security cameras from my phone, scanning every angle. Nothing yet, but the feeling in my gut told me it was only a matter of time. She was going to make her move, and when she did, she wouldn't be subtle. Around 10 a.m., the first real sign of trouble appeared. My neighbor called, whispering nervously, "I think Karen's trying to get into your yard. She's climbing over the fence." I froze. Climbing over the fence, really? She wasn't even trying to be discreet. I felt a mixture of disbelief and amusement. This was Karen, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. She believed her authority was absolute, that rules existed only to bend toward her whim. I grabbed my phone and slipped quietly into the hallway, pretending to be on a call while keeping an eye on the front door. My heart was racing, but my voice stayed calm, steady. Karen was methodical, almost comical in her obsession. She inspected every bush, every corner of the lawn, muttering to herself about violations that existed only in her mind. She checked my windows, crouched down like a spy, peered into the house, then backed away, scribbling notes furiously. Time seemed to stretch, each second thick with suspense. I could hear her muttering about illegal decorations, unsanctioned pathways, and community standards. She paused every few moments to glance at the street, as if expecting reinforcements, or maybe just reassurance that she still commanded respect. My dog barked softly from the kitchen, eyeing her warily, and I had to bite back a laugh. She looked ridiculous, paranoid, and dangerous all at once. Then the moment came that made my stomach drop. She moved toward the side door, the one I thought she wouldn't notice. Her fingers brushed the handle. She was about to cross a line, and I knew it. This was the point of no return. She had no idea what she was walking into, no clue that she was about to make a very big mistake. I felt my pulse quicken, adrenaline kicking in. She thought she was in control, but the truth was, she was about to be stopped cold. I leaned against the wall, calm and steady, waiting for her next move. I didn't need to rush, didn't need to confront her yet. The suspense, the tension, was my ally. Karen was so focused on her imaginary authority, so obsessed with her rules, that she didn't notice the first hint that I was watching, ready, prepared. And in that moment, I realized this was going to be a showdown that neither of us would forget. The scene was set. Karen was packing, poised to break into my house, and I was right behind the curtain, watching every move, calculating every reaction. It was only a matter of time before the first dramatic moment happened, the one that would change everything. And I knew, deep down, that she had no idea what she was about to walk into. I was in the kitchen when I heard it, the faint creak of the front door like a warning bell. At first, I froze, thinking maybe my nerves were getting the better of me. But then I saw her hand on the handle, pushing, twisting like she owned the place. Karen. She had actually crossed the line. She wasn't knocking, she wasn't politely announcing herself. She was barging in, convinced she had the right, convinced she was untouchable. I could hear her muttering under her breath as the door slowly opened, something about community standards and illegal occupancy. Her voice was sharp, almost theatrical, the kind of tone someone uses when they truly believe the world revolves around them. I stayed quiet, letting her think she was in control. Every second she spent inside was another second for her arrogance to build, and I could feel it, like a storm gathering just out of sight. As she stepped in, clipboard in hand, I noticed how deliberate her movements were. She inspected the living room first, packing back and forth, tapping on tables, picking up knickknacks, and glaring at anything she deemed inappropriate. She checked the bookshelves, adjusted throw pillows, even peeked behind the curtains. At one point, she bent down to examine the rug as if it contained secret violations only she could detect. I could barely keep a straight face. This was absurd, ridiculous, and somehow terrifying all at once. I let her continue for a moment, observing every exaggerated gesture, every muttered complaint. She paused in the kitchen doorway, scanning the counters like a hawk, her eyes narrowing at my perfectly ordinary coffee maker. She shook her head and scribbled furiously on her clipboard. "This appliance arrangement is unacceptable," she whispered to herself. I almost laughed out loud. Almost. Then she moved toward my bedroom, the part of the house she had been avoiding, maybe out of caution, maybe because she didn't notice the door before. As she approached, she muttered about hidden violations and unpermitted areas. My pulse quickened. This was it. She was about to find something that would change everything. I stayed in the shadows, calm, silent, letting her advance. Every step she took echoed like a drumbeat of suspense. I noticed her glance toward a small drawer slightly ajar on my dresser. Curiosity, or maybe instinct, drew her closer. She leaned in, fingers twitching over the handle, oblivious to the fact that she was about to uncover something she wasn't prepared for. I felt my stomach tighten. This was the turning point. Karen had no idea who she was dealing with, and she was seconds away from finding out. She opened the drawer, peering inside. Her eyes widened, her confident smirk faltering. She had found it, a badge tucked among some old paperwork. A small, unassuming metal badge that carried weight she couldn't comprehend. She froze, staring at it like it was a bomb about to go off. I stayed behind the doorway, silent, letting her panic rise. It was fascinating, almost like watching a storm unfold in slow motion. Her voice trembled, the first crack in her armor. She stammered, trying to justify her intrusion, claiming she was enforcing community rules and protecting the neighborhood. It was comical if it weren't terrifying. Her obsession had driven her into my house, into my space, and now reality was hitting her like a freight train. She realized she had underestimated me, that her self-appointed authority had no bearing here, and that she was deeply, profoundly out of her depth. I took a slow step forward, my presence finally known. Karen's eyes darted toward me, panic and disbelief battling for dominance on her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words faltered. The power she believed she had, the control she imagined, evaporated in an instant. She was trapped, exposed, and scrambling for an escape that didn't exist. The tension in the room was electric, the kind of suspense that tightens your chest and keeps your mind racing. And then she made a fateful decision. She tried to retreat toward the door, probably thinking she could still save face, thinking her authority could somehow shield her from consequences. But that move would lead to an escalation neither of us could ignore. I stayed calm, my voice steady, my movements deliberate. Karen's break-in had just crossed the line, and there was no turning back now. The showdown had begun. For a moment, Karen just stood there, frozen, staring at the badge in my hand. I could see the panic setting in, the gears turning in her head as she realized she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, like she was trying to speak, but the right words wouldn't come. She had spent years imagining herself as the ultimate authority in the neighborhood, and now she was facing the truth. She wasn't in charge here. Not at all. I stepped closer, keeping my voice calm, measured. "You shouldn't have come in here," I said, letting the words hang in the air. She flinched slightly, like she had just realized the gravity of her situation. Karen had no idea that this wasn't just another petty argument over mailbox rules or lawn heights. This was serious, and she had walked straight into it. She started to stammer, trying to explain herself. I'm protecting the community. I was checking rules violations." Her words tumbled out in a jumble, each one weaker than the last. The confidence she had carried for so long was gone, replaced by raw, panicked desperation. She looked around the room, searching for allies, for witnesses, for anything that might save her, but there was nothing. It was just her, me, and the consequences of her choices. I watched her silently, letting her realize the absurdity of her own actions. The way she had barged in, acting like she owned the place, now seemed almost comical, except for the fact that she had no idea who she was dealing with. Every exaggerated gesture, every frantic scribble on her clipboard, every muttered complaint about community standards, all of it was about to collapse under the weight of reality. And then came the moment that made my pulse quicken. She reached toward a drawer, probably thinking she could find some proof or justification, and that's when she noticed another hint of my identity. A tactical vest tucked away, a glimpse of training gear, things she had never imagined existed behind my doors. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, fear replaced arrogance. She had underestimated me completely, and now the realization was crushing her. Her breathing grew shallow, rapid. She tried to regain control, pointing her clipboard like a shield, like it could protect her from the consequences. "I have the authority," she shouted, her voice cracking under the weight of panic. "I am the HOA president. I make the rules." I couldn't help but smirk at the absurdity. The more she shouted, the clearer it became that her authority meant nothing here. I let her continue, letting the tension build. Every second of her panic, every frantic glance, every stammering sentence added to the suspense. It was a delicate dance, a slow burn of tension. She didn't know whether to run or fight, and the realization that she had no control over the situation was sinking in fast. Her whole world, built on imagined power, was collapsing. Then she made a mistake. She tried to retreat toward the door, thinking maybe she could escape and save face. But I stepped in her path, calmly, deliberately, like I had all the time in the world. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, charged with the kind of tension that makes your stomach knot. Karen froze, realizing she had nowhere to go. The panic in her eyes was unmistakable. I spoke again, my voice low, steady. "This isn't a negotiation." She swallowed hard, realizing the gravity of the situation. Every word she had prepared, every imagined argument, every self-important claim, none of it mattered anymore. She had crossed a line, and now she was going to face the consequences. The room was silent except for her rapid breathing and the faint sound of my own calm heartbeat. It was a moment suspended in time, the kind of suspense that grips you in your chest and won't let go. Karen had walked into my house thinking she was in control, thinking she could enforce her rules, and now she was trapped in the reality of her actions. The showdown had escalated, and there was no turning back. And in that instant, I knew the next step had to be taken. The calm before the storm was over. Karen had forced my hand, and I was ready to act. The consequences she had ignored for so long were about to catch up to her, and she had no idea how fast things were going to move. The suspense in the room was unbearable, the tension almost visible. She was about to find out exactly what happens when you underestimate the wrong person. I took a slow step forward, letting the weight of my presence settle in the room. Karen's eyes darted around frantically, searching for any escape, any imagined authority that could save her. But there was nothing. She was trapped, exposed, and the confidence she had carried so proudly was gone. For the first time, she realized she had no control, no power, and no plan. She raised her clipboard like it was a weapon, her fingers trembling. I'm enforcing the community rules. This house, your property, it's violating everything." Her voice cracked with desperation, and I could almost see the gears in her head spinning faster than she could handle. She didn't know that shouting about imaginary rules wasn't going to help her now. She had gone too far. I stayed calm, my voice steady, even as my heart rate picked up. "You shouldn't have come in here," I said, letting the words hang in the air. "You can't just break into someone's home because you think you're in charge." The moment was thick with tension. Karen's nostrils flared, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for words that didn't exist. Her ego was crumbling right before my eyes, and the suspense in the room was almost unbearable. She spun around, glancing at the door like maybe she could still make a run for it. But I moved slowly, deliberately, blocking her path. Her eyes widened, panic overtaking her arrogance. She muttered something about fines and community obligations, but her voice lacked conviction. The authority she believed she wielded had evaporated in an instant. She was just a woman standing in my living room, cornered and desperate. And then she did something that made my pulse quicken. She lunged toward the door, hopping to escape before the situation escalated further. But I was ready. I grabbed her arm gently but firmly, stopping her in her tracks. Her eyes went wide with shock, disbelief, and fear. She realized finally that her actions had consequences, and those consequences were closing in faster than she could process. I spoke again, calm but firm. "You need to stay right here until this is sorted out." She hesitated, trying to argue, but her words faltered. The confidence she had relied on for so long was gone, replaced with sheer panic. She waved her clipboard helplessly, shouting about rules and authority, but it sounded hollow, ridiculous even to her. She had built her entire identity around control, and now she had none. The suspense in the room was palpable. Every second dragged like hours. Her breathing was rapid, shallow, and uneven. I could feel the tension radiating from her like heat. She didn't know what I would do next, and the uncertainty was eating away at her composure. I let her stew in that fear for a few moments, letting the psychological pressure build. Karen was finally starting to understand that she had made a monumental mistake. I reached for my phone, dialing dispatch. "I need backup," I said quietly, keeping my voice steady, professional. She froze at the sound of my voice, her panic spiking. She hadn't anticipated that I would call for support. In her mind, she had assumed the situation was still in her control. It was not anymore. As I spoke to dispatch, I watched Karen flail, packing back and forth like a trapped animal. She shouted about her authority, about community standards, about fines she had levied in her mind. None of it mattered. The suspense was so thick you could almost cut it with a knife. She was trapped, exposed, and completely aware that things were about to get worse. I ended the call and pocketed my phone, my eyes never leaving hers. She tried to compose herself, straighten her clothes, act like a queen who had been momentarily startled. But it was too late. The tension had reached its peak. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, and the consequences were just moments away. The air was heavy with anticipation, and the suspense was almost unbearable. And then we both heard it, the distant wail of sirens growing louder with every second. Karen's face went pale, her frantic gestures slowing. She realized that whatever plan she had, whatever authority she believed she held, was about to collide with reality. The next few minutes were going to change everything, and she had no idea how fast it would happen. The showdown had escalated to its final stage. The wail of the sirens grew louder, echoing through the quiet streets of the neighborhood like a warning. Karen's eyes widened, and her frantic gestures slowed as the reality of the situation finally hit her. She was about to face consequences she had never imagined. The clipboard she had been clutching like a shield now hung uselessly at her side, and the confident mask she had worn for so long was completely gone. I stayed calm, my voice steady, letting the tension build. "The police are on their way," I said quietly, almost casually, but the weight of the words hit her like a punch. She froze, staring at me like I had just spoken in an alien language. She had always believed her authority could protect her, that the rules she invented were enough to bend reality in her favor. Now she realized with growing horror that she was utterly powerless. She tried to speak, her voice trembling. I'm the president, the HOA, I make the rules." Each word was weaker than the last, collapsing under the weight of her panic. I let her fumble, watching the slow unraveling of someone who had built an entire identity on imagined power. The suspense was unbearable. Every second she lingered in my house without thinking, the tension thickened, pressing down on the room. Through the window, I could see flashing lights reflecting off the walls. The officers had arrived. Karen's panic spiked, and she started packing, muttering about community standards, fines, and imaginary authority that would protect her. Her logic, always warped by ego, now sounded ridiculous even to her. She tried to look assertive, but it was too late. The reality of the situation had eclipsed her fantasy. I reached for my phone again, keeping one eye on her and one on the approaching officers. "Stay right there," I said calmly. She flinched, realizing she couldn't just storm out or argue her way free. Every escape route she had imagined was gone. The suspense in the room was almost tangible. It was the kind of moment that makes your heart race, even when you're the calmest person in the room. The officers arrived at the front door and stepped inside, their presence filling the room with authority. Karen's eyes darted between them and me, panic now full-blown. She sputtered something about authority and rights, but the words fell flat. The officers moved deliberately, professional, and Karen realized, finally, that the fantasy she had been living in was over. She was just a woman standing in a house, facing consequences she had ignored for far too long. I watched as she tried to compose herself, straighten her clothes, act like a queen who had momentarily stumbled. It didn't work. The tension, the suspense, the reality of the situation had broken her. She was shouting, flailing, trying to assert her imagined power, but it had no effect. The officers were calm, unflinching, and in complete control. The room, which had been filled with her bluster, was now dominated by reality. One of the officers stepped forward and gently but firmly took her arm. She resisted, tried to pull away, but it was no use. The handcuffs clicked around her wrists, the sound sharp and final. Karen's eyes went wide, her mouth opening in shock. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, and she had no one to blame but herself. The suspense that had built over days, weeks even, had finally reached its peak, and now it was resolving in a way she hadn't anticipated. Neighbors started peeking from windows, drawn by the flashing lights and shouting. Some whispered, some giggled, some just watched in disbelief. Karen shouted about fines, violations, and community rules as the officers led her toward the door. Her protestations were meaningless now, swallowed by the weight of reality. The suspense was replaced by a strange mixture of relief and satisfaction. I had stayed calm. I had let her panic build, and now the inevitable had arrived. As she was led away, her face a mixture of fury, disbelief, and humiliation, I felt a quiet sense of triumph. Karen had underestimated me, ignored boundaries, and crossed a line she shouldn't have. The neighborhood would talk about this for weeks, maybe months, but for now, the tension had resolved. The suspense that had gripped the air was gone, replaced by the quiet aftermath of consequences finally catching up. I closed the door, took a deep breath, and let the adrenaline fade. The house was quiet again, and for the first time in days, I could breathe. The confrontation was over, and Karen's reign of imagined authority had come to an abrupt, dramatic end. The suspense had carried through every second of the ordeal, but now the story had reached its turning point. And yet, I knew the neighborhood would never forget this day. The handcuffs clicked around Karen's wrists, and I could see her panic peak. She was shouting, flailing, pointing at imaginary rules and fines that didn't exist. "I am the HOA president. I make the rules," she screamed, but her words were empty, hollow. The authority she had clung to for so long had evaporated in an instant, replaced by the reality of consequences she couldn't control. It was mesmerizing, almost surreal, watching her unravel like this. The officers led her toward the door, and I followed behind at a calm, deliberate pace. Neighbors peeked through windows, some whispering to each other, others snapping photos on their phones. I could hear muted gasps, muffled laughter, and the occasional, "finally," from someone who had endured Karen's reign for months, maybe years. The neighborhood was witnessing the fall of someone who had imagined herself untouchable, and the suspense that had built over days was reaching its peak. She struggled as they guided her outside, her face a mixture of fury and disbelief. Her hair was slightly disheveled, her blouse rumpled, and her lipstick smeared from frantic gestures. The image was almost cinematic, like something out of a dark comedy. She shouted about fines, regulations, and community standards, but the officers ignored her, moving efficiently and calmly. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on me, and I felt a strange mix of relief and satisfaction. As we reached the sidewalk, I could see the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the pavement. The sound of the sirens seemed to echo in slow motion, punctuating the dramatic downfall of Karen, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. She tried one last desperate plea, twisting her body, pointing her finger, and shouting about authority, but it was too late. The suspense, the tension, the drama, all of it had built to this moment, and now it was resolving. I stepped back slightly, letting the officers take full control, and watched as Karen was guided into the patrol car. Her face twisted in a mixture of anger, disbelief, and humiliation. She shouted once more, something about "the community will understand." But the words were lost in the blaring sirens and the murmurs of the neighbors. The suspense of the past days, the paranoia, the creeping dread she had instilled in the neighborhood, all of it was ending in a way that was strangely satisfying. As the patrol car pulled away, the neighborhood slowly began to exhale. Doors closed gently, blinds were pulled back up, and the quiet returned to the streets. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The tension, the suspense, the absurdity of what had just happened. It was overwhelming. Karen had underestimated me, she had crossed boundaries, and she had learned in the most dramatic way possible that there were consequences to her actions. I walked back inside, closing the door behind me. The house felt almost sacred again, quiet and calm after the storm. My dog followed me, tilting his head like he understood something had changed. The adrenaline slowly faded, replaced by a strange mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. The suspense had carried me through every heartbeat, every creak of the floorboards, every frantic movement of Karen's hands. And now, the resolution had arrived. As I sat down, I reflected on the surreal nature of what had just occurred. A neighbor had broken into my home, convinced of her imaginary authority, and had been stopped, restrained, and removed from the premises. The suspense had been unbearable at times, but it had also made the outcome that much sweeter. She had built herself up as untouchable, and watching her crumble, helpless and exposed, was almost cinematic in its perfection. The story of Karen's downfall would spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Whispers of disbelief, laughter, and moral lessons would travel from door to door, and I knew some people would relish telling it for months. The suspense, the drama, the tension, all of it had come together to create a moment that nobody, not even Karen, would forget. And while the neighborhood might buzz about the incident for a long time, for me, it was a quiet victory. The adrenaline faded further, and I allowed myself a small, ironic smile. Karen had thought she was untouchable, unstoppable, and all-powerful. She had underestimated me, underestimated reality, and underestimated consequences. The suspense of the past days had finally broken, leaving only the quiet aftermath of justice served. The story wasn't over yet, but the climax, the most dramatic part, had arrived, and the neighborhood would never see her the same way again. After the patrol car disappeared down the street, the neighborhood finally began to settle. The tension that had hung over my house like a storm cloud for days was gone, leaving a strange, almost surreal quiet. The blinds were pulled back up, doors closed gently, and the usual hum of suburban life started to return. For the first time in what felt like weeks, I could breathe without a knot of anxiety tightening my chest. My dog wandered around, sniffing cautiously, as if checking that the intruder who had disrupted our lives was truly gone. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the empty street. The adrenaline was fatting, leaving a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction in its place. Karen had thought she was untouchable, a ruler of her imagined kingdom, but reality had a way of humbling even the most delusional. And now, the neighborhood could see it too. I could already imagine the whispers starting, the gossip spreading from house to house. "Did you hear about Karen? She actually broke into someone's house. And the police came." The story would travel like wildfire, exaggerated in some corners, laughed over in others, and serve as a cautionary tale about ego and overreach. The suspense of the past week would be retold, but the outcome was clear. Karen had been stopped in her tracks. Neighbors began to peek through their windows again, cautiously at first, then with quiet curiosity. Some waved as I walked past, subtle nods of recognition for enduring the ordeal. A few came over later, whispering stories of their own encounters with Karen, laughing softly about her obsession with lawns, mailboxes, and non-existent violations. The humor of it all began to sink in. The absurdity of a grown woman believing she could break into someone's house and enforce her personal rules. As I reflected on everything, I realized just how close it had been. Karen had been reckless, dangerous in her obsession, and utterly convinced of her authority. If I hadn't stayed calm, if I hadn't been prepared, the situation could have escalated in ways that were far less amusing and far more serious. The suspense had been gripping, yes, but it had also been a reminder to respect boundaries, even with someone as unpredictable as Karen. I walked through the house, checking the locks, the security cameras, and the windows one more time. Everything was exactly as it should be, peaceful and secure. The echoes of the confrontation still lingered in my mind, the frantic gestures, the muttered complaints, the futile shouting about fines and rules, but the storm had passed. The drama had peaked, the suspense had resolved, and now came the quiet aftermath, the part where the neighborhood could finally breathe too. And yet, even as I enjoyed the calm, I knew Karen's story wasn't over entirely. Rumor had it she was filing appeals, drafting letters from behind bars, convinced she would return with vengeance and new rules. I smiled at the thought. Let her try. After everything, I had seen the limits of her power, and the neighborhood had too. The suspense had taught her a lesson, whether she accepted it or not, and for now, that was enough. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the stars, I reflected on the absurdity and intensity of it all. A neighbor had broken into my home, convinced of her authority, and had been stopped in a way she couldn't have predicted. The tension, the suspense, and the drama had all built up perfectly, climaxing in her arrest and the relief that followed. It was almost cinematic, almost too perfect to believe. And as quiet returned, I realized something important. Some battles are worth fighting, especially when they involve standing your ground and letting reality catch up with people who overstep. Karen had thought she could intimidate, manipulate, and control. She had been wrong, spectacularly wrong. The suspense had been unbearable at times, but it had made the outcome sweeter, sharper, and unforgettable. The neighborhood would never forget this day. People would tell the story for years, each retelling adding a little drama, a little humor, a little suspense. And I would sit quietly, sipping my coffee, shaking my head at how ridiculous it all had been, but smiling because justice, in its own dramatic way, had been served. Karen had underestimated me, underestimated consequences, and underestimated reality. And for that, the story had a perfect ending. The street was calm again, my house peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, standing your ground is the best story you can ever tell. The suspense was over, the drama resolved, and the neighborhood could finally rest, at least until the next Karen decided to think she was invincible. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.